Now, for the first 2.5 months of the pandemic, the streets of downtown Lexington were quiet as most businesses were closed and people stayed home due to the shutdown. That all changed the week that George Floyd was killed in police custody in Minneapolis, which was captured on video, igniting protests and social unrest across the country. LX18's Catherine Collins and Mike Valenti covered weeks of protests here in downtown Lexington. They take us on a walk through the places that have been pivotal to the movement and tell us what it means at the ballot box this November.
It's right here outside the courthouse on the corner of South Limestone and Main Street that protesters met here in downtown Lexington night after night following the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor.
That's right, and while crowd sizes could vary, there were multiple nights when this square was filled with hundreds of protesters right before they marched for miles downtown.
And those protests remain almost entirely nonviolent, although there were a handful of arrests, mostly because people were standing in the street. But from the beginning, protesters here have been focused on issues both locally and nationally, calling for change right here in Lexington.
This is what democracy looks like.
And as demonstrators across the country were taking to the streets to protest police brutality, activists here in Lexington were ramping up their organizing efforts.
It's not just protest for the sake of protest, that it's not just about Breonna Taylor, that it's not just about George Floyd, that we do actually have local demands that will help keep Black and Indigenous people of color here in Lexington safer.
A group called LPD Accountability revealed a list of demands for the Lexington Police Department, including a call for a citizens review board for police officers accused of misconduct and the end to the use of no-knock warrants.
And those demands came as congressional leaders in D.C. were feeling the pressure to pass a comprehensive police reform bill. Meanwhile, the Democratic Senate primary here in Kentucky was heating up, and progressive challenger and state representative Charles Booker became a familiar sight on the ground at protests in Louisville.
There is nothing we can't do.
And as he chanted with protesters, he began gaining traction amongst voters.
We are not going to miss this moment. This is our time. This is our time.
After Amy McGrath defeated Booker in the primary in late June, he threw his support behind her in the race against Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. But Booker and a select few progressive state representatives have continued to focus their energy on the fight against systemic racism.
This is my calling. This is the work that I was built to do.
For State Representative Attica Scott, much of that fight has been focused on calling for justice for Breonna Taylor.
Scott has been a mainstay at Louisville's now over 150 days of demonstrations, where at times tensions with police have been high.
Despite all of the arrests that have happened from city to city of people who've been standing up for justice, folks are still coming out in even larger numbers, and it's happening all around the world.
But she's also been calling for change in policing in Kentucky and around the country, pushing to pass Breonna's law to ban no-knock warrants statewide. And one sign of progress, she says, is that other states have started to follow suit, pre-filing similar legislation.
She continues to encourage activists and anyone who cares about the Black Lives Matter movement to vote this November.
We all know who's been there for us and who hasn't been there for us. So I don't say to people how to vote for one candidate or the other, but I do say, please vote.
Because she says representation is the key to systemic change. And Scott wants to see these young people run for office themselves in the coming years.
I would be the first Black woman in almost 2 decades to serve in our state legislature, and the only one right now currently serving in our state legislature if people hadn't turned out to vote for me. So it's important that we support the people that we know are going to fight for and with us in local, state, and federal office, and we have to elect them in order for that to happen.
Scott will be the first to tell you that the fight for change within our institutions cannot end after Election Day. But since protests began in late May, protesters have gained some small victories.
Yeah, and that brings us here to the place formerly known as Cheapside Park, where Black men, women, and children were sold as property for decades. You'll remember over the summer, protesters came here chanting, "Take back Cheapside," as people at bars sat looking on.
And that movement gained traction when over the summer, the city decided to rename Cheapside to Henry Tandy Centennial Park. Now, he's a prominent Lexingtonian who helped to build the old courthouse.
Protesters have made it clear this is a sign of progress, But it's not enough. They want more than just symbolic change. For State of the Commonwealth, I'm Mike Valenti.
And I'm Catherine Collins.